There is nothing like the sound of a rotary cutter cutting through fabric. It's the sound of potential, the sound of projects that are new and yet to be completed. But it's also a very important part of quilting. Great cuts make for precise quilts, and in this video, I'm going to share some tips for great cutting on your quilts. First, and most importantly, and probably most obvious, go ahead and make sure you have a new rotary blade. I'm sure you're not like me thinking, I'll just make it last a little bit longer, but just trust me on this, put a new blade in, you're gonna get the best cuts. Now, once you've picked out your fabric and you're ready to start cutting it, here's a couple things to keep in mind. First, you wanna make sure it's nice and pressed. We don't need any big creases in your fabric to alter our cutting lines. Now, the question that comes up sometimes is, do you pre-wash your fabrics? Which you can. I don't like to do it because then I have to wash it and then iron it before I even get to cutting. If you do that, just make sure it's nice and flat, and a little spray starch will help that. Now, when you're dealing with bigger pieces of fabric, folding it in half is pretty much necessary. It's not only quicker, most of us don't have tables large enough to cut the fabric in one continuous piece. First, I want you to make sure that the folded edge is parallel to your selvage. Basically, I don't want it twisted while I'm cutting. That's not going to give me a beautiful right angle. Now, one thing that I've always done for as long as I've been a quilter, I've always placed the fold away from me. I don't know why, but I've recently saw online, of all places, that if you cut it with the fold closest to you, that will help ensure that you have that nice 90-degree angle when you make your cut. So go ahead and turn your fabric around. Make sure that it's parallel with the lines on your mat. And what I'll do is clean it up by taking a nice cut right here on the edge. What I'm hoping to achieve is a perfect right angle in this corner. That right angle means when I cut it, my strip won't be warped. Now I could eyeball it or use the lines on my mat, but I'm gonna cut just a little strip and do a quick test before I start cutting this into bigger chunks. Now with my little strip, if I open it up at the fold line, it should be nice and straight, which thank goodness it is. It's almost like I know what I'm doing. Whew. Now that you're ready to start cutting your fabric into the pieces for your quilt, here's the thing to keep in mind. I want to use the ruler for my measuring and not necessarily the lines on the mat. If you're using the ruler, that's going to prevent you from always cutting on the same point of your mat and wearing your mat out too quickly. So let's look at our fabric. Let's pretend I want to cut a 2-inch strip. When I position my ruler in place, I'm going to line up my 2-inch line with the edge of my fabric. And I almost want it to look like that line is straddling that edge, or it's directly over that edge. I don't want to see it on either side. Now when I go to cut, I'm going to have the most control when the rotary blade is parallel to my hand, and that means I'm going to have to move my hand as I cut. What I don't want to do is have my hand down here and my ruler up there. We can see what's going to happen. Another tip that will help you keep control of your ruler is to line up your hand with your pinky on the edge of your ruler, and that's just going to help keep it in place and to keep it from sliding off to the side. So when I go to cut, I start cutting, pause, reposition my hands, hold it in place, and continue on. And there you go, a beautiful, perfect 2-inch strip. And if I want to double check, I can just make sure that again, it's running nice and straight. If it isn't cut right, it will kind of go off to an angle, and that's not going to result in easy to piece borders or pieces of your block. Now that we know how to cut perfect strips, how do we do it quickly? Because it's one thing to do it right, we also want to do it fast, right? Or is that just me? Possibly. If I'm cutting a lot of strips, let's say 2-inch strips, what I like to do is start with the furthest cut and cut multiple, working my way back to my cut edge. Let me show you what I mean. So if I'm doing my 2-inch strips, I have a 6-inch ruler right here. I know with 6 inches, I can get 3 2-inch strips. So if I line my 6-inch up on the edge of my fabric, I know that's going to give me enough for 3 strips. And actually I'm going to slide it down just a bit. I try not to have the edge of my fabric on the edge of the ruler. I want a little bit of overlap to my ruler. That's going to help get my cut going before I touch that fabric. So lining up that 6-inch line, just taking a second to make sure it's straight all the way across, I'm going to make that first cut. Now what I can do is, without moving the fabric, I'm going to gently shift over my ruler to the 4-inch line. So now I can make my next cut. And then my last cut on the 2-inch line. That means instead of picking up my ruler each time I make a cut, I only have to pick it up once, and I have 3 beautiful, ready-to-piece strips for my quilt. If I'm cutting my fabric into an unusual size, let's say 2 7/8, it might be worth it to use washi tape or something to mark that line. That way you can quickly have a visual, especially if you're using a ruler that's very efficient and very handy on the different sizes it has, but it also has a lot of different numbers. If I were going to cut a strip 2 7/8, it would be this mark right here. I can use washi tape to mark that to give me a reference line. This tape isn't meant to act as my line, it's just a visual reference so I know which line it is I'm lining up at the edge of my fabric. So I'm going to pull it off to the side just a bit so I can still see that mark and still line it up. And I'm going to put it in a couple places, maybe at the top and the bottom. I don't need one strip for the whole line, so that I can line it up at the top, line it up at the bottom, and get to cutting. You can also use that washi tape to help you make your square rulers the right side for trimming up your blocks. You know, for when you start piecing and realize that you have hundreds of dog ears to trim off your half square triangles. When that happens, it always seems like I don't have quite the right size square ruler that I need, so I'm going to use that handy tape to make it work. It's a good idea to have a range of ruler sizes. It's just going to help make it a little bit more efficient. But if you have a square that's not quite the right size to what you're trimming up your blocks to, using that washi tape is going to help give you that visual reference. So if I needed to use this 4.5-inch ruler to square up 2.5-inch blocks, I'm going to take just a couple seconds to add a piece of tape to make my square, and that will save me a lot of time in the long run. And just like I did with the other ruler, I'm going to put that tape just inside the line so that I can still see it when I'm lining it up on my fabric. When it comes to having a variety of quilting rulers, I'm going to share with you my favorite sizes to have on hand. Then from there, you can really go wild with all the variations that are available. I like to have a nice wide ruler. This is great for not only cutting strips, but also cutting strip sets, especially if I have one that needs to be cut on the angle. A thicker ruler will let me cut bigger strips without having to reposition it. So this is definitely a great one. Of course, we've already seen my square. I love to have square rulers, and if possible, I like to have a smaller one and a bigger one. That's going to help me when I'm squaring up my blocks or trimming off hundreds and hundreds of those little dog ears on my half square triangles. Another ruler that I love to have is a longer, skinny ruler. So this is great for cutting strips into smaller pieces. I like to use this for straightening up my fabric. It's great when I don't need a big, wide ruler and I don't have to whip that around quite as much. And then another wider ruler. This one's 12.5 inches long by 8.5 inches. And so this is a good, versatile size for cutting up bigger blocks. So if I had to only pick a few rulers, this is what I would go for, but I mean, come on, you know I have a lot more rulers than that. But the idea is I want to use the right ruler for the right job. It's going to make it more efficient and result in a lot better cutting. So there you have it. Those are my tips and tricks for quick and precise cutting for your quilts. Well, happy quilt cutting!